The sound of rushing cars and honking horns filled the air as people hurried to their destinations, lost in their busy lives. But amid the chaos of the bustling street, one small figure stood out, a helpless puppy, alone and scared. Abandoned in the middle of the road, it was surrounded by nothing but the roar of traffic. The tiny creature's eyes darted around, unsure of where to go, as the vehicle zoomed past dangerously close. It was a heartbreaking sight, one that seemed like it was going to end in disaster. But then, something unexpected happened. A young boy, no older than 10, was walking home from school when he noticed a terrified puppy in the street. Without a second thought, he rushed into action. Despite the danger, he didn't hesitate. His heart told him to help, and that's exactly what he did. But what followed was something no one could have predicted. This wasn't just a story about a boy saving a puppy, it's a tale that will touch your soul, make you believe in the kindness of strangers, and remind you of the unexpected bonds that can form between humans and animals. As the boy approached the puppy, he could feel the weight of the moment. The street was unforgiving, and every second mattered. The puppy, though frightened, seemed to sense that the boy meant no harm. In a rush of instinct, the boy scooped the tiny creature into his arms and dashed to the safety of the sidewalk. People on the street stopped in their tracks, some watching in awe, others in disbelief. How could a child be so brave in the face of danger? How could a small puppy find a protector in the most unlikely of circumstances? But the story doesn't end there. What happened next will absolutely melt your heart. The boy, cradling the puppy in his arms, didn't just take it home and call it a day. No, this act of kindness set off a chain of events that no one could have imagined. As the boy looked into the puppy's eyes, something stirred within him, a sense of responsibility, of connection. This wasn't just a rescued animal, this was a new friend, a companion, someone to share his world with. The journey ahead would test the bond between the boy and the puppy in ways they couldn't foresee. Would the boy's family accept this new addition to their home? How would the puppy adapt to its new life, and what challenges would the boy face as he tried to care for it? But even more importantly, what would the puppy's past reveal about its abandonment? The mysteries of this tiny creature's life before the boy found it are more heartbreaking than anyone could guess. Now, as the boy and his new furry friend embark on a new chapter, they're not just learning how to live together, they're about to discover the true meaning of love, friendship, and loyalty. But not everything is as simple as it seems. As the boy's journey with the puppy unfolds, he faces choices that could change both of their lives forever. There are moments of joy, moments of struggle, and moments that will leave you holding your breath, wondering what happens next. So, what happens when a boy saves a puppy from certain danger? The answer will surprise you, and it will leave your heart warmer than ever before. Stay tuned to find out what comes next in this incredible journey of compassion and connection. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. The boy, whose name was Ethan, had always been the quiet type. He wasn't the kind of kid to jump into the spotlight, nor was he the one to draw attention to himself. He lived a simple life with his single mother, a kind-hearted woman who worked long hours at the local diner just to make ends meet. Ethan often spent his afternoons walking home alone, with the company of his thoughts and the quiet hum of the world around him. But that day, when he saw the puppy in the street, something inside him changed. Ethan had never seen a puppy like this before. It was a scruffy little thing, its fur matted and dirty, and its ribs were visible beneath its thin coat. The little creature was shaking, likely from both fear and hunger. Ethan had to admit, part of him was scared too. After all, the street was no place for an animal so small and fragile. But when he looked into the puppy's eyes, he felt a pull he couldn't ignore. Those eyes, full of confusion and trust, seemed to silently ask for help. It was as if the puppy knew Ethan was its only hope. Without even thinking about it, Ethan rushed to the middle of the street, narrowly avoiding an oncoming car. The driver honked loudly, but Ethan didn't care. The puppy was more important. The moment he scooped it into his arms, a flood of emotions hit him. The puppy wasn't just a stray, this was a living being who had been through something difficult. But Ethan didn't have all the answers yet, and he wouldn't until later. As he carried the puppy to safety, the weight of the world seemed to fall off his shoulders. He was now responsible for this little life. Ethan's mother would have to know about this new addition to their home. He wasn't sure how she'd react, but he knew one thing for sure, he couldn't leave the puppy alone out there. He could feel it in his heart that it needed him just as much as he needed it. When Ethan got home, he rushed inside with the puppy still tucked safely in his arms. His mother, who had just returned from work, looked up from the kitchen counter, surprised to see her son carrying the small animal. She was about to ask questions when Ethan spoke first. "Mom, I found this puppy outside, and it needs help. It's all alone, and I couldn't just leave it." His mother's eyes softened as she walked over. She knelt down, gently running her fingers through the puppy's tangled fur. "It's a good thing you found it, Ethan," she said, her voice calm but concerned. "But we'll have to take it to the vet and make sure it's all right." Ethan nodded, but deep down, he knew there was more to the puppy's story than met the eye. As much as he hoped his mother would agree to keep the little dog, he couldn't shake the feeling that there were things about its past that would soon come to light. How had it ended up abandoned in the street? Who had left it there? And why? That night, after dinner, Ethan lay in bed with the puppy curled up at his feet. He couldn't stop thinking about the answers he needed. What was the puppy's life like before it found him? How did it survive out there alone in such a busy, dangerous world? He decided he would do whatever it took to learn the truth, whatever the cost. The next day, Ethan took the puppy to the vet. The visit didn't go as smoothly as he'd hoped. The vet, a kind woman named Dr. Taylor, informed Ethan that the puppy was malnourished and had likely been wandering the streets for a while. But there was something more. The puppy had a small collar with a faint name tag on it, but it was so worn out that the name was barely legible. "This collar looks old," Dr. Taylor observed. "It could be a clue, Ethan. But I think we'll need to do some more digging to find out where this puppy really came from." Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. A collar? A name tag? The thought that someone might have known this puppy, might have even loved it, before abandoning it left him feeling unsettled. He couldn't understand how someone could do such a thing, but he was determined to get to the bottom of it. As the days passed, Ethan and the puppy, whom he had decided to name Max, grew closer. Max followed him everywhere, and Ethan quickly became attached to the little dog. But the mystery of Max's past still haunted him. Every time he looked at the puppy, he wondered about the life it had before it ended up on that street. Who was its family? Why did they leave it behind? And would Ethan ever get the answers he desperately needed? One afternoon, as he was walking Max through the neighborhood, something unexpected happened. A woman, strangely familiar to Ethan, approached him. She was looking directly at Max, her eyes wide with recognition. And then, she spoke, her voice shaking. "Is that my dog?" Ethan froze. The woman's voice, trembling with emotion, was enough to make his heart race. She stared at Max, her eyes wide with something between disbelief and longing. It took a moment for Ethan to process what she had said. "Is that my dog?" she repeated, her voice softer now but still filled with urgency. Max, sensing the shift in the air, let out a small bark and wagged his tail, looking at the woman curiously. Ethan's mind raced. Could this woman really be the owner of the puppy he had saved? His first instinct was to protect Max. This puppy was his responsibility now. But the woman looked so distressed, and there was a familiarity in her gaze that made Ethan hesitate. I'm not sure," Ethan stammered, unsure of what to say. "I found him on the street. He was all alone. He didn't know how to explain that this puppy had already become part of his world in such a short time. The thought of giving him up didn't feel right." The woman took a step closer, her eyes fixed on Max. "His name's Charlie," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. I'm his owner. I'm so sorry I lost him." Her voice cracked, and Ethan noticed the pain in her expression. The same puppy he had rescued, the one who had already begun to heal his heart, might have a past tied to this woman. But Ethan still felt a pang of doubt. How could she have lost him in the first place? Max, or Charlie, didn't seem to recognize the woman right away. He cautiously stepped back, unsure whether to approach her. His eyes shifted between her and Ethan, almost as if he was torn between the two people who now seemed to claim him. Ethan's protective instincts kicked in. He had no idea who this woman was, or what had happened between her and the puppy. For all he knew, she could be the reason Charlie had been abandoned on the street in the first place. "How did you lose him?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice calm but firm. "He was alone out there, in the middle of a busy street." "You're telling me you just—" "I never meant for this to happen," the woman interrupted, her voice shaking. She rubbed her eyes, trying to keep her composure. "I didn't abandon him. I swear. It's just, everything's been falling apart. I've been going through some things. I couldn't keep him anymore." Ethan's suspicions began to shift. There was something in her voice that made him feel for her, something raw and real that suggested this wasn't as simple as neglect. Maybe she had been in a tough spot. But the more he thought about it, the more questions arose. Why hadn't she made an effort to find him? How long had Charlie been out there alone? And why did she wait so long to come looking? Max, or Charlie, seemed to sense the tension between them. He took a few cautious steps toward the woman, sniffing her hand, but still hesitated, unsure whether to trust her or not. It was as though he had a choice to make: return to the woman who had been his owner, or stay with Ethan, the boy who had saved him. Ethan's heart wavered. He glanced down at the puppy, at Charlie, who had now laid down on the ground between the two of them, his little tail slowly wagging. Ethan could see how much Charlie had changed since they first met. The puppy had gone from scared and trembling to calm and trusting in a way that made Ethan feel like he had been the one to give him a new chance at life. The woman, still standing before them, looked desperate now. "Please, I'm asking for him back," she said. "I've made mistakes, but I love him. I just couldn't take care of him anymore. Please don't take him from me." Ethan felt the weight of the decision on his shoulders. He wanted to believe her. Maybe she had been going through something hard, maybe she was telling the truth. But the doubt still lingered. He thought about his own life, the one where he had struggled to make sense of things. He couldn't imagine abandoning someone who had depended on him. Charlie deserved more than that, and Ethan wasn't sure he could trust someone who had let him go. Yet, at the same time, he couldn't deny the sorrow in the woman's eyes. Maybe she had been trying to make things right, but perhaps her situation was more complicated than it seemed. The tension hung in the air as Ethan stood there, torn between two worlds. Would he keep Max, his only companion through some of the loneliest times of his life? Or would he allow the puppy to return to the woman who claimed to love him, despite the uncertainty surrounding her? "Maybe there's a way we can figure this out," Ethan said slowly, trying to buy himself some time. "But I need to know more. I can't just give him back without knowing he's going to be okay." The woman nodded, her face lighting up with a hint of relief. "I understand. I can explain everything. I didn't know who else to turn to." But just as Ethan was about to agree to hear her out, a figure appeared in the distance, walking quickly toward them. It was a man, and there was something about his presence that made Ethan's stomach drop. The man's eyes locked onto Charlie, and without missing a beat, he stepped forward and shouted, "Where's my dog?" The woman's face went pale as she looked at the man, then back at Ethan. "This is going to get complicated," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't want him to find out." Ethan's heart raced. Who was this man, and what did he want with Charlie? The mystery deepened, and now the story had taken another unexpected turn. Would this man's arrival change everything? Would Ethan be able to protect Charlie, or was he about to lose him forever? Ethan's mind raced as the man approached, his footsteps echoing on the pavement, his eyes locked on Charlie. The air seemed to thicken with tension, and for a moment, the world around them felt as if it had stopped. The woman beside Ethan grew visibly anxious, her hands trembling at her sides. She stepped forward as the man reached them, but her voice barely came out. You can't just take him," she said softly, almost pleading, her eyes flicking nervously between the man and Ethan. The man's gaze was cold, unwavering. His posture was rigid as he stepped closer to Charlie, who, for the first time, seemed to shrink away from the approaching stranger. "He's mine," the man said flatly, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. His eyes darted from the woman to Ethan, then back down to Charlie, who was now looking up at him with a mixture of fear and confusion. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. What kind of person would act this way toward a puppy they claimed to care about? The protective instinct that had surfaced the moment he found Charlie flared up once again. He stepped in front of the man, positioning himself between the stranger and the puppy. "No," Ethan said firmly, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and determination. "You can't just show up and demand him back. Who are you? What do you want with him?" The man's eyes narrowed, and for a split second, Ethan saw something flash in them, anger, frustration, maybe even a hint of guilt. But then the man straightened himself, looking down at Ethan with a sneer. "I'm his owner. I'm the one who's been paying for his care, the one who's had to deal with his problems. So, you'd better step aside, kid." The woman's face turned pale, and she stepped back as if she had just witnessed something dangerous. Ethan felt her fear, but it only made him more determined to stand his ground. "I don't care about any of that," Ethan said, his voice now full of conviction. "Charlie, Max, isn't just a dog to be tossed around. He's been through too much already. And if you really cared about him, you wouldn't have left him on the street." The man's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he growled. "I've been doing what I can. You have no right to lecture me about what I've been through." Ethan's eyes flicked to the woman, who had gone silent now, her face full of regret. Her posture had changed, her shoulders slumped as if the weight of a heavy burden had settled on her. "Tell me what's going on," Ethan demanded. "Why was he abandoned? Why did you leave him?" For a moment, the woman hesitated, as though she was caught between the truth and the lies that had kept her silent for so long. She opened her mouth but closed it again, unable to find the words. The man stepped forward, as if to stop her, but Ethan raised a hand to stop him. "Let her speak," Ethan said firmly. He wasn't going to back down. Not now, not when so much was at stake. The woman finally took a deep breath, her voice shaky but clear. "It's complicated," she began. "The man you're talking to, he's my ex-husband. We adopted Charlie together when we were still married. But after everything fell apart, I couldn't take care of him. I had to move to a smaller place, I couldn't afford the vet bills, and I thought he'd be better off with him." She glanced at the man, who now looked away, his face hardening. But I never intended for him to end up on the street. I thought he would be safe. I didn't know he would. Her voice broke, and she wiped her eyes. Ethan's head spun as he tried to process what he was hearing. The puppy, Charlie, had been caught in the middle of a broken marriage, and now it seemed like he had been tossed back and forth between two people who weren't willing to make the hard decisions. The man didn't seem moved by her words. Instead, he took a step forward, clearly determined to take Charlie back. I don't care what you think, he said, his voice harsh. He's mine. I'm the one who's been paying for everything. I'm the one who's been taking care of him. But you weren't there when he needed you, Ethan shot back. You weren't there when he was out on the street, scared and alone. He's been through enough. The man's face flushed with anger, and for a moment, it looked like things were about to escalate. Ethan could feel the tension building, like something was about to snap. Charlie, still between them, let out a small whimper, as if sensing the rising hostility. Ethan stood his ground. This wasn't just about a dog, it was about what was best for Charlie. And right now, he knew the puppy was scared, confused, and caught in the middle of a war he had no part in. He couldn't let him go back to this. Not like this. Not when Charlie had found safety in his arms. The woman, her eyes filled with sorrow, reached out and touched Ethan's arm, almost pleading. Please, she whispered. You have to understand, I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't know how to fix everything. I didn't want to be the one who gave him up. Ethan glanced at her and then back at the man, whose glare was as cold as ice. His pulse quickened. Everything was hanging by a thread now, and it felt like the smallest move could tip it all over the edge. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew it wasn't just about Charlie anymore, it was about doing the right thing. But as the man took another step forward, something shifted in the air. And just as Ethan opened his mouth to speak, a voice cut through the tension. Stop! Everyone turned toward the new voice, another figure, one they hadn't expected. The voice that interrupted them came from a figure emerging from the shadows, and Ethan's heart skipped a beat. A man, tall and wearing a weather jacket, walked toward them with a look of urgency in his eyes. He was older than the man who had claimed Charlie, but there was something about him, an intensity that seemed to make the air crackle with tension. He didn't pause or waste words. His gaze was locked onto Charlie immediately, and there was a sense of ownership in his stance that made Ethan's stomach churn. Where is he? The man demanded, his voice low and firm. The woman, visibly shaken, turned to the newcomer. You, she whispered, her voice barely audible. What are you doing here? Ethan looked back and forth between the two men, confusion sweeping over him. Who was this new man, and why did he seem so certain that Charlie belonged to him? The other man, Charlie's supposed owner, stepped forward, his fists clenched as he glared at the newcomer. What do you want with my dog? He growled, his voice full of hostility. The older man didn't flinch. Your dog, he repeated, an edge in his voice. This dog belongs to me, and you know it. What are you doing here? Ethan felt as if the ground was slipping beneath his feet. He had already been dealing with one complicated situation, but now this new man had arrived, and everything was spiraling out of control. Charlie, Max, was caught between three strangers now, and Ethan had no idea which one of them was telling the truth. His heart ached for the puppy, who seemed more confused than ever, his small body trembling as he looked up at the faces of the adults around him. The woman, still standing beside Ethan, took a shaky step back, her eyes wide with realization. You're the one who, her voice faltered. She seemed unable to finish the thought, and Ethan couldn't help but feel that something much darker was lurking beneath the surface. The man who had claimed Charlie stepped closer to the newcomer. What's this? You're not getting away with this, Roy. You lost him. You abandoned him. He's mine now. But the man named Roy only shook his head, his expression unreadable. You never even tried to find him, he said, his voice suddenly softer, almost regretful. You gave up on him when things got hard. And now you want to come here and pretend like you're the one who's been looking out for him. You've got no right. Ethan stood frozen, watching as the two men exchanged harsh words. The weight of their animosity was palpable, and for a moment, he felt completely out of place. What had been a simple act of rescuing a stray dog had turned into something much more complicated. This wasn't just about a lost puppy anymore, it was about tangled histories, broken promises, and wounds that had never healed. The woman, who had been quiet for too long, suddenly stepped forward, her face pale. Roy's right, she said, her voice strained. I didn't want to admit it, but he's the one who Charlie really belongs to. Ethan's chest tightened at her words. What do you mean? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The pieces were falling into place, but he couldn't quite put them together. This woman, Charlie's supposed owner, had been the one who had left him, yet now she was saying that Roy was the true owner. What was going on? Roy's eyes softened for the first time, and he took a step toward the puppy. I'm not here to make things harder for anyone. I know I messed up. But I've spent the last year trying to find him. And now, I finally have a chance to make things right. Ethan felt a surge of confusion. Who was Roy really? What had happened to this puppy before he had found him in the street? The story was becoming more and more tangled with each new revelation, and it seemed like there were so many layers to this situation that Ethan couldn't see through it all. But just as he was about to speak, the woman turned sharply, her eyes wide with a sudden realization. Wait, she gasped, her voice rising in panic. He's been with someone else. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Everyone turned to her, as if in unison, waiting for her to explain. She took a deep breath, her face now pale with fear. The reason he ended up on the street, it wasn't just because I couldn't take care of him. There was someone else. Someone who took him from me. Ethan's heart sank as he processed her words. Someone had taken Charlie? This wasn't just a simple case of abandonment or neglect, it was something much darker. Who would take a puppy and leave him to wander the streets? And why? Before anyone could speak, the woman looked at Ethan, her eyes filled with dread. I thought it was over, but now I know he's not safe. Not with them. Not ever. The mystery deepened, and the stakes grew even higher. Ethan could feel the tension crackling in the air. Who were these people? What had they done to Charlie? And who was the one responsible for making the puppy's life so uncertain? As the secrets began to unfold, one thing was clear, Charlie's past wasn't as simple as anyone had imagined. And as Ethan stood in the midst of the turmoil, he couldn't help but wonder just how far he was willing to go to protect this innocent little puppy, who was caught in the middle of so many unresolved conflicts. Then, as if in response to everything that had just been said, the sound of a distant car engine rumbled closer, cutting through the tension. It was a sound that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Something was coming, and it wasn't going to be good. The car's engine grew louder, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow down. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears as he turned to look at the approaching vehicle. The woman's eyes widened in fear, and Roy stiffened, his gaze fixed on the road. Charlie, still uncertain, let out a low whimper, as if he sensed that something significant was about to happen. The car pulled up, its tires crunching on the gravel as it came to a stop. The door swung open, and out stepped a man. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and sunglasses, though it was clear the sunglasses weren't necessary for the dimming afternoon light. The air around him felt different, cold, calculated. The woman recoiled as he stepped closer, and Ethan could see her face drain of color. Is this the place? The man's voice cut through the tense silence, deep and menacing. The woman took a shaky step backward, her hands wringing nervously. I didn't know where else to go, she whispered, almost pleading with him. I was trying to protect him. Ethan watched, confused and anxious, as the new arrival fixed his gaze on Charlie. The puppy seemed to shrink back, sensing the danger. The man looked at the woman, then at Roy, and finally at Ethan with a steely expression. This is your doing, isn't it? He said to Roy, his voice low and dangerous. Roy didn't flinch. You know it is, he replied. But it's over now. I'm taking him. Before Ethan could process what was happening, the man turned his sharp eyes to him. You've made a mistake, kid, he said, his tone colder than anything Ethan had ever heard. You should have stayed out of it. That puppy doesn't belong to any of you. You're all just pawns in a bigger game. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. The man's lips twisted into a small, cruel smile. You think you've been saving him? Think again. You've been part of a bigger plan the whole time. Charlie is a property. The way he said property sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. The man took a step forward, and Ethan instinctively took a step back. And I've come to take him back where he belongs. The words hit Ethan like a punch. Property? What kind of person would refer to a dog in such a way? Charlie wasn't some object, not a thing to be owned or traded. He was a living creature who had endured so much already. Ethan felt a surge of protectiveness, stronger than ever before. Roy took a breath, his expression hardening. You know who this is, don't you? Roy asked the woman, who was now shaking her head in disbelief. The woman looked between the man and Roy, her face contorted with confusion and fear. No. No, it can't be. You promised me. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. I promised you nothing. You should have known better than to try and escape. Charlie was never meant to be yours to keep. Ethan was beginning to piece things together, though it was far darker than he could have imagined. Charlie wasn't just some lost puppy. This man, this stranger, wasn't just an angry ex-owner or a rescuer. He was a part of something much more sinister, something tied to Charlie's origins. Ethan felt his chest tighten as the truth hit him with full force. This wasn't just about a dog, it was about control, manipulation, and a world Ethan hadn't known existed. He took a step forward, placing himself in front of Charlie. The puppy, though scared, seemed to trust him. "You won't touch him," Ethan said, his voice firm and steady, though his hands were trembling. "He's not yours." The man sneered, clearly amused by Ethan's defiance. "You think you can stop me?" he chuckled darkly. "You're just a kid playing hero. I'm not here to argue with you." He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small folder, and held it up in front of Ethan. "This is my proof. I own Charlie. Legally. Every trace of this dog's history is tied to me. You've been meddling in things you don't understand." Ethan felt the world tilt beneath him. This wasn't a simple case of rescuing a dog. The documents in the man's hand confirmed it. Charlie had been part of a breeding scheme, something dark and profitable, and Ethan had unknowingly walked into the middle of it. The woman collapsed into a nearby chair, her hands covering her face. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know he was a part of that." Ethan's mind raced as the weight of the situation settled in. This wasn't just about an abandoned puppy, it was about greed, control, and manipulation. Charlie had been a pawn in a much larger, much more dangerous game than he could have imagined. Before Ethan could say another word, Roy stepped forward, blocking the man's path. "I'm not letting you take him," Roy said, his voice filled with an uncharacteristic determination. "Not this time." The man's eyes narrowed, and he took a step back, a slow smile forming on his lips. "You're all out of your depth," he said quietly. "But if you want to try and stop me, be my guest." Ethan could feel the tension building, the stakes higher than ever. It was clear this was the final confrontation, the climax of a story that had turned darker with every passing moment. Yet, just as the man took another step toward Charlie, a siren sounded in the distance, growing louder by the second. Suddenly, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, followed by the screech of tires. The man froze, his expression shifting to one of alarm. "No," he muttered, turning to look at the road in panic. Before anyone could react, a group of uniformed police officers rushed onto the scene, their badges glinting under the fading sunlight. The man who had been so confident just moments ago now looked cornered, his face a mixture of fury and fear. "You're too late," he snarled, but his words seemed to fall flat as the officers moved in. Ethan stood there, his heart still racing, as the police quickly took control of the situation. The officer in charge looked at Ethan, then at Roy, and then finally at the woman, who was now sitting quietly, her hands still shaking. "I think you've all got a lot of explaining to do," the officer said calmly, as they moved in to take the man into custody. But as the man was led away, he shot one final look at Ethan, his eyes filled with hatred. "This isn't over," he spat. Ethan watched as the man was driven away, his mind still spinning with everything that had just happened. But through all the chaos, one thing was clear: Charlie was safe. And no one, not even this stranger, could take him away now. The sirens faded into the distance, but Ethan didn't move. He looked down at Charlie, who now sat at his feet, his tail slowly wagging, as if the storm that had just passed through them was already forgotten. But as Ethan knelt down to pet him, a nagging feeling lingered. Something still wasn't right. He hadn't heard the last of this, not by a long shot. The police officers eventually left, taking the man with them, and the chaos that had filled the air began to settle. The sun, which had been hidden behind clouds, peeked out from the horizon, casting a soft glow on the scene. Ethan stood silently, looking down at Charlie, who was now resting comfortably at his feet. Despite everything that had happened, the puppy seemed at peace, finally feeling safe after such a long, uncertain journey. Roy walked up to Ethan, his expression still serious but with a sense of relief that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For stepping in when you did. I know it wasn't easy, but you did the right thing." Ethan nodded, though he still couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing from the story. There were too many unanswered questions, too many twists and turns that didn't make sense. But he wasn't about to dwell on it. He had come to realize that some things couldn't be figured out immediately. Some stories took time to fully unfold. The woman, who had been standing off to the side, walked over, her face tired but grateful. "I don't know how to thank you," she said to Roy, her voice breaking. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought I was protecting him, but I ended up doing the exact opposite." Roy reached out and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You were trying to do what you thought was best. No one can fault you for that. We all make mistakes." Ethan watched the two of them, silently processing everything that had happened. The woman wasn't the villain in this story, nor was Roy. They were just people caught in the middle of a much larger, darker situation. In the end, it wasn't about blame, it was about making things right, and giving Charlie the chance he deserved. As the group stood there, Ethan realized that Charlie's journey wasn't just about the puppy finding a home, it was about finding the right people who would truly care for him, no matter what. He had witnessed firsthand the kind of love and dedication that went into rescuing an animal, but he had also seen the ugly side of the world, where greed and manipulation tore lives apart. And yet, in the end, it was the kindness of strangers that made all the difference. Charlie gave a small yawn, his tail wagging gently as he looked up at Ethan. For the first time in what seemed like forever, there was a sense of peace in the air. It wasn't perfect, and there would likely be more struggles ahead, but at least Charlie was safe. At least he had a chance at a better life, one where he could be loved and cared for. Ethan knelt down and scratched the puppy's ears, smiling as Charlie responded with a happy wiggle of his little body. "You're going to be okay," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. "You're finally free." Roy glanced over at Ethan, as if sensing the quiet reflection. "You're a good kid," he said with a small grin. "You've got a big heart. Don't ever lose that." The woman, still emotional but calmer now, wiped a tear from her cheek. "Thank you," she said again. "For everything." Ethan didn't need any more words. He understood now that sometimes the best way to show love was simply to be there when it mattered. In a world that could be so chaotic and uncertain, the smallest acts of kindness could make all the difference. As the sun dipped lower into the sky, Ethan stood up and looked at the two of them. He could see that, for better or worse, things had changed for all of them. Roy had reclaimed what was his, but the bond between him and Charlie would never be the same. The woman had let go of the puppy, but she had learned hard lessons along the way. And Ethan, though unsure of the future, had found a new sense of purpose in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Charlie gave one last happy bark before trotting over to Roy, who bent down to pet him. For the first time in a long while, Roy's face softened. He may not have had all the answers, but he knew now that Charlie had a place in the world, a place where he would be cared for and loved. As Ethan turned to leave, he couldn't help but glance back at the scene one last time. The world was full of people trying to do their best in a complicated, often broken system. But in that moment, it felt like the puzzle pieces had finally fallen into place for Charlie. His life, once full of uncertainty and danger, was now beginning a new chapter, a chapter where love, not fear, would guide him. Ethan smiled softly, knowing that sometimes the smallest actions, like rescuing a puppy from a busy street, could lead to the most unexpected, life-changing outcomes. And as he walked away, he felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that the world was just a little bit better for Charlie, and for all the other animals who deserved the chance to be truly loved. The story may have been complicated, but the resolution was simple: love always finds a way.